Che Guevara left behind the life of a doctor to fight in jungles and mountains, chasing a dream of revolution. But behind the brave image was a man driven by violence and obsession, whose choices split nations, left people living in fear, and in the end, led him toward a brutal, unforgettable fate. It goes back to early October 1967, when Che Guevara was a very different man from the young revolutionary who had once helped lead Cuba to victory. There were no roaring crowds now, no gunfire in celebration. Instead, he was deep in the lonely hills of Bolivia, far from his family, worn down by sickness, and constantly on the move to avoid capture. Months before, he had arrived in Bolivia so quietly that almost no one knew he was there. He used a false name, carried a forged Uruguayan passport, and kept his movements secret. His idea was to light the first spark of a new revolution in Bolivia and let it spread across South America. He saw the country's location, right in the center of the continent, sharing borders with 5 nations, as the perfect starting point. From here, he believed armed uprisings could spread like wildfire. But from the very beginning, his plan ran into trouble. He had counted on recruiting locals and building trust with the Bolivian Communist Party. Instead, he found that many people didn't want to get involved. Some feared the army's brutal crackdowns. Others didn't trust an Argentine leading a fight on Bolivian soil. Even within the Communist Party, there was no agreement. Some leaders supported him, while others thought his mission would only bring disaster. Without strong local allies, his dream of raising a large guerrilla force began to fade. The land itself made things even harder. The countryside in southeastern Bolivia was nothing like the mountains where Che had fought in Cuba. Here, the hills were steep and rocky with thick brush that slowed every step. There were almost no real roads, just narrow dirt tracks that turned to mud when it rained. Days were hot and dusty, nights cold and damp. The air was heavy, and for someone with asthma like Che, every climb and every march was exhausting. The villages scattered through the hills were desperately poor. Most families lived in small adobe houses and grew only enough food to survive. Some kept goats or chickens. When Che's group ran out of supplies, they had no choice but to take food from these villagers. It wasn't done with cruelty, but it left the locals resentful. To them, these armed strangers weren't saviors. They were another danger in an already hard life. And there was no hiding who they were. In Cuba, Che's fighters could blend in with friendly rural communities. In Bolivia, their accents, their clothes, and even their body language marked them as outsiders. People noticed them. Word spread quickly. By the start of October, the situation was desperate. Che's force, which had started with around 50 fighters, was now down to fewer than 20. Some had been killed in firefights. Others had been captured by the army. A few had simply disappeared in the night, choosing survival over loyalty. Che himself was struggling to keep up. His asthma attacks came more often, and his inhaler was nearly empty. Even short hikes left him gasping for air. On October 7, 1967, his group moved into the Uro Ravine, a remote valley in southeastern Bolivia. The spot seemed safe, hidden by steep walls and dense vegetation, but safety depended on one thing: that no one could know they were there, and that safety was about to vanish. Local peasants spotted the guerrillas and slipped away to tell the Bolivian army. They weren't loyal to the soldiers. They were scared of what would happen if they stayed silent. The army had a reputation for punishing anyone who helped rebels. Soldiers promised the villagers protection, and in a place where food was scarce, they also offered supplies. It was enough to make the villagers talk. The response was quick. Units from the 2nd Ranger Battalion, trained earlier that year by U.S. Green Berets, were sent to the area. These troops were better equipped, better trained, and had one mission, which was to find Che and wipe out his remaining men. The morning of October 8th, 1967 began quietly. Che's small group moved carefully along the bottom of the Uro Ravine. He walked with his head turning from side to side, alert for danger. He had learned to be careful after months of close calls, but this time the danger wasn't ahead of him. It was above him. Bolivian soldiers had quietly climbed into position earlier that morning, spreading out along the ridges. From up there, they could see almost every movement below. They had the advantage of height, cover, and surprise. Around 1:30 in the afternoon, the stillness shattered. Gunfire cracked from the slopes. The sound echoed off the ravine walls, making it impossible to tell where the shots were coming from. The soldiers fired with FN FAL rifles, and their bullets tore through branches, spraying dirt into the air. The first to fall were Simeon Cuba Sarabia, known to the men as Willie, and Aniceto Reinaga Gordillo. Both were hit before they could get behind cover. They collapsed in the mud, motionless. A third fighter was badly wounded and tried to crawl toward the shelter of a boulder. Che aimed his old M1 carbine, trying to return fire, but just as he raised it, a bullet struck the barrel, bending it out of shape. The weapon was useless. He drew his pistol, but after only a few shots it jammed. A bullet grazed his right leg, tearing through his pants and leaving a thin line of blood. The pain slowed him, and he knew he could not run. Realizing they were trapped, Che shouted for his men to stop shooting. The soldiers were closing in from all sides. A group of rangers rushed forward and pointed their rifles directly at him. Che let his pistol drop in the mud. One soldier stepped behind him and yanked his arms back, binding his wrists tightly with a thin cord. His backpack was pulled off his shoulders and searched. Inside, they found his diaries, hand-drawn maps of the area, and a few medical supplies. The trap had worked perfectly. After months of chasing rumors and tracking footprints through the hills, the Bolivian army had captured the man they had been hunting. Che was now their prisoner, wounded but alive. The soldiers kept a close eye on him every step of the way. They didn't speak much, except to bark orders for him to move faster. When he slowed down, they shoved him forward or jabbed him with a rifle. The trail to La Higuera wasn't easy. It twisted up and down steep hills, sometimes so narrow that only one person could pass at a time. Loose rocks slid underfoot, and thorny bushes scraped against their legs. Che's leg hurt badly with each step. The rope tied around his wrists was so tight it dug into his skin and made his fingers tingle. His clothes were damp with sweat. The soldiers walked in a tight formation around him, rifles ready. They weren't just worried about him running. They feared his remaining fighters might try to spring an ambush. Every few minutes, they stopped to scan the hills, listening for movement in the thick brush. It took hours to reach La Higuera. The sun was already dipping low when they arrived. The village was tiny. Life here moved slowly, and strangers were rare. The main building in the village was the small schoolhouse. It was a single room with cracked mud walls, a few wooden benches, and a floor of packed dirt. The soldiers pushed Che inside. They left his hands tied and posted guards at the door and near the only window. Inside, Che leaned against the wall, breathing heavily with his eyes half closed. Outside, curious villagers gathered in small groups. Some had heard his name before from whispers passed between soldiers or traveling merchants. Others only knew there was a foreigner in chains. Some looked at him with fear, others with quiet fascination. By nightfall, the story of his capture had already started to spread far beyond the hills. Messages were being sent to military headquarters and beyond to La Paz, and even outside Bolivia. Something big was coming, and Che knew it. In the small town of Valle Grande, about 50 kilometers from La Higuera, a group of high-ranking officers sat around a table. Papers, maps, and radios were scattered in front of them. Among them was Felix Rodriguez, a Cuban who had fled after the revolution and now worked with the CIA. He believed Che should be kept alive. If they could question him, they might learn about other guerrilla groups in South America. But President René Barrientos saw things differently. From the capital in La Paz, he worried that keeping Che alive would be more dangerous than killing him. A public trial could turn Che into a symbol, drawing crowds, protests, and even attempts to free him. In Barrientos' mind, a dead Che would be less trouble than a living one. As the evening of October 8th turned into night, the decision was made. Barrientos gave a clear order that Che was to be executed the next day without trial. The message was sent by radio to La Higuera. Back in the little schoolhouse, Che sat in the half-dark, still tied up. Outside, he could hear soldiers laughing, drinking, and talking in low voices. No one told him about the order, but he didn't need to be told. He had been in enough battles to sense what was coming. The night would be long, and for Che, it would be his last. Sometime during the night, Fleek Rodriguez stepped inside. He crouched next to Che and began asking questions, including names of fighters in other countries, where they were hiding, and what their plans were. Che listened, but answered little. His words were short and guarded. He spoke just enough to be polite, but gave nothing away that could help the soldiers or the CIA. A few villagers came quietly, carrying food they hoped to give him, but the guards at the door blocked them and told them to leave. No one from outside was allowed in. The rest of the village slept in silence. In Valle Grande, military officers were awake, waiting for word that the order would be carried out at dawn. Che would not stand in a courtroom. He would not give speeches or defend his cause. The decision was already set, and nothing was going to change it. The next day, Che woke up before the sun rose. Around 7 a.m., Fleek Rodriguez came in again. He spoke calmly, telling Che that arrangements were being made. The words were vague, but Che didn't need an explanation. He knew what arrangements were being made. Elsewhere in the village, officers had picked the man who would do the shooting. Sergeant Mario Terran. Terran was young, but had already been in several firefights with Che's group. He had lost 3 close friends in those battles. The officers assumed that this personal loss would make him eager to pull the trigger. But when the order reached him, Terran's hands shook. His face went pale, and it was clear he wasn't as ready as they thought. Back in the schoolhouse, Che sat quietly on the bench, still bound at the wrists. No one told him the exact time, but he could sense the hours slipping away. Guards came and went, sometimes glancing in through the door or window, but few said anything. Outside, the soldiers' activity grew more focused. By early afternoon, everything was ready. Felix stepped into the schoolhouse and told Che it was time to go. 2 soldiers bent down and untied the rope around his ankles. When Che stood, he leaned to one side. His hurt leg was stiff and slow to move. They walked him out into the bright midday sun. The air was warm now. A few villagers stood far back, watching silently. The soldiers guided him to a small building only a short distance away. It was the village laundry room, a simple place with cracked walls. The floor was rough and uneven underfoot. Inside, Sergeant Mario Terran was already waiting. He gripped an M2 carbine tightly. His orders were to aim for the body first, not the head, so it could be said later that Che had died from wounds in battle. Terran's face was tense, and there was a slight tremor in his hands. Che stood a few steps away facing him. His dark hair was tangled, and his clothes were marked with dirt, sweat, and dried blood. He did not beg or plead. His eyes were steady. Outside the laundry room, other soldiers gathered in a loose crowd. Many wanted to witness the end, but most avoided meeting Che's gaze. Terran lifted the rifle. The room was quiet, except for his breathing. Then, with a sharp crack, the first bullets tore into Che's legs. The sound was loud in the small space. Che's knees buckled, and pain shot through him. But for a brief moment he stayed standing, leaning slightly forward, as if refusing to go down. Then he lost his balance and fell onto his side. Terran stepped closer. Another round of shots hit Che in the chest and arms. His body jerked with each impact. His breathing slowed, turning into deep, uneven gasps. Blood began to soak through his shirt. A third burst struck him in the side. Che's face was pale now, but his eyes stayed open, fixed on nothing in particular. The last shot was aimed at his heart, which ended it. It was about 1:10 in the afternoon on October 9th, 1967. Che was only 39 years old. He lay still on the laundry room floor. Outside, the soldiers stepped away. Nobody shouted or celebrated. it was over. The man they had chased for months was dead, and everyone knew the world outside this small village would soon hear about it. After the killing, the soldiers moved quickly. Che's body was placed on a stretcher, but before it could be flown away, something unusual was done. His hands were cut off. They were preserved in jars of formaldehyde so his fingerprints could be used for official identification. This was to prove to the world, especially in foreign governments, that the man they had killed was indeed Ernesto Che Guevara. His body was then lifted into a helicopter and flown to Valle Grande. Upon arrival, it was taken to the hospital called Nuestra Señora de Malta. But it wasn't brought into a private room. It was placed in the hospital's laundry room. Soon, military officers, doctors, journalists, and photographers crowded inside. Bright camera flashes lit up the room as pictures were taken from every angle. In many of these photographs, Che's eyes were still open, his hair messy, and his body stretched out as if in a strange kind of display. These images spread quickly. Within days, they were published in newspapers and shown on television across the globe. To many, the photos were shocking. Che looked almost peaceful, even in death. For others, they were a symbol of defeat. By nightfall, however, the mood shifted. The Bolivian authorities worried that his grave could become a rallying point for his supporters. They didn't want a place where people could come, leave flowers, and turn his death into a cause. So under heavy secrecy, the soldiers took his body away. They buried him in an unmarked grave somewhere near Valle Grande. The burial was done quietly, in the dark, with only a handful of people knowing the exact spot. For decades, his remains stayed hidden. Rumors spread, with some saying he had been buried under the runway of Valle Grande's airstrip to make sure no one could dig him up, while others claimed he had been moved to another location entirely. It wasn't until 1997, almost 30 years later, that his bones were finally found and returned to Cuba, where he was reburied with full honors. News of his death spread across the world in a matter of hours. In Cuba, people wept openly in the streets. Schools and workplaces paused to hold moments of silence. For many, it felt like losing a family member. Across Latin America, students, farmers, and young revolutionaries mourned the man they saw as a fighter for justice. But in other places, the reaction was the opposite. Government leaders and military officials who had feared his influence celebrated his end. To them, it was proof that rebellions could be crushed. In the small, quiet village of La Guevara, the schoolhouse where Che had spent his last night became a strange kind of landmark. At first, it was left abandoned. Locals went about their lives, but visitors from around the world slowly began to arrive, curious to see the place where the famous guerrilla leader had met his end. Over the years, the building became part of Che's legend. Tourists took photos. Activists held small gatherings, and historians recorded the stories of villagers who had been there in 1967.